The weight of dumbbells clanked against polished steel. A golden glow from overhead spotlights washed over rows of mirrors, each reflecting bodies sculpted like statues. This wasn't an ordinary gym. It was Las Vegas's crown jewel fitness center, a place where celebrities trained and where respect was measured not by character but by muscle and money. Posters of American champions lined the walls, their faces frozen in glory. Trainers barked orders, influencers filmed their routines, and athletes posed in designer gear. Into this glittering space walked Manny Pacquiao. No entourage, no cameras, no flash. Just a humble figure in a plain white training shirt, faded jogging pants, and sneakers that had clearly seen better days. A simple duffel bag hung from his shoulder. He carried himself with the same calm grace he carried into every arena, not as a celebrity, not as a senator, not even as a boxing legend, but as a man who knew who he was without needing to prove it. Some heads turned, curious. Others barely noticed. To many in this gym, he looked like just another middle-aged man ready for a workout. But one pair of eyes noticed and narrowed. Standing near the center of the floor, chalk dust coating his massive hands, was Dave Bautista. Former WWE superstar, Hollywood actor, larger-than-life personality. His muscles bulged under a sleeveless tank, tattoos crawling across his arms. He towered over almost everyone in the room, his presence as heavy as the weights stacked behind him. Dave's smirk spread slowly as his gaze locked on Manny. He didn't see a champion. He didn't see a global icon. All he saw was a small man from another land stepping into his territory. "Hey," Dave's voice boomed, cutting across the music pounding through the speakers. Conversations froze. Phones tilted. A few influencers stopped mid-recording. Dave pointed, his grin twisting into disdain. "Did you get lost, Pacquiao? This isn't the Philippines. This is America. Go back home where you belong." Gasps rippled across the gym. A couple of lifters exchanged awkward glances. Someone chuckled nervously. A few voices even whispered, "Is he serious?" The air shifted, the atmosphere no longer about fitness, but confrontation. All eyes turned to Manny. Would he fire back? Would he walk out? Would he even acknowledge the insult? But Manny's response was none of these. He simply lowered his bag onto the floor, adjusted the wraps on his hands, and gave a small polite nod. His calm expression revealed no anger, no shame, no frustration, only quiet patience. In a gym that worshipped arrogance, his silence was louder than any insult. And yet, no one realized that this quiet moment was just the beginning. Because in less than 10 minutes, the same America that was laughing with Bautista would be left stunned by Manny Pacquiao's response. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button. The gym fell into an uneasy silence, the kind that comes before a storm. Dave Bautista's laughter echoed off the mirrored walls, a deep, mocking rumble that fed the tension in the air. His words, "Go back to the Philippines," still hung like smoke, poisoning the atmosphere. Some of the younger lifters grinned nervously, trying to act like they were in on the joke. A few others whispered, shaking their heads at the blatant disrespect. But most? They simply watched, phones raised, eager to capture whatever was about to unfold. Dave, feeding off the attention, spread his arms wide like a performer on stage. "Look at him," he bellowed. "The so-called legend. Small, quiet, afraid. This is America, Manny. You don't belong here. You're out of your league." His booming voice filled the gym, drowning out the music. He flexed deliberately, rolling his shoulders, his tattoos stretching as he paced like a lion, showing off its power. He wanted the crowd to laugh with him. He wanted Manny humiliated. But Manny did not flinch. He calmly bent down, untied his shoes, and relaced them with deliberate care. His every movement was slow, steady, unshaken. He looked not at Dave, not at the crowd, but at his own hands, as if the insults were just background noise, unworthy of his attention. The silence of his response made the arrogance louder. A young woman near the treadmills whispered to her friend, Why isn't he saying anything? Another man shook his head. Maybe he can't handle Bautista. He looks out of place here. Dave heard the whispers and his grin widened. He threw his arm around another bodybuilder nearby and laughed, voice dripping with sarcasm. You, see? Even his own people don't believe in him. He's nothing without a ring. Here, he's just another nobody. A few in the crowd chuckled, emboldened by Dave's mockery. One man muttered under his breath, "Yeah, maybe he should stick to boxing. This is a real man's gym." Still, Manny remained calm. He pulled his training gloves from his bag, slid them onto his hands, and adjusted the straps with quiet precision. The simple Velcro rip of the gloves was the only answer he gave to Bautista's roar. The crowd shifted uneasily. Something about his calm was unsettling. Some leaned forward, waiting for him to snap. Others pulled out their phones, eager to capture the moment they thought would surely come. Manny lashing back in anger, shouting, throwing punches, but no such explosion came. Instead, Manny looked up, just once, and gave the faintest of smiles. It wasn't the smile of a man broken. It was the smile of someone who knew something no one else did. That tiny gesture, so small and so quiet, unsettled Bautista more than any shouted comeback could have. His brow furrowed, his smirk faltered for a second. He stomped closer, pointing, a thick finger at Manny's chest. "You think silence makes you strong? No, it makes you weak. Say something, show them you belong here." But Manny said nothing. He simply tightened his wraps and stood, his posture calm, steady, unshakable. The whispers in the gym grew louder now, not mocking this time, but curious. Why isn't he reacting? Is he scared, or is he waiting? Doesn't Bautista know who that is? Phones stayed raised. The world was watching, and while Dave thought he was controlling the moment, in reality the power was quietly shifting. Every second of Manny's calm was turning Bautista's noise into desperation. Something was building, something no one expected, and soon, the man Dave mocked as a nobody would show America what true strength looked like. The clang of weights resumed slowly, but the atmosphere inside the Las Vegas gym had changed. It wasn't the same routine hum of treadmills and dumbbells anymore. It was charged, restless, uneasy. All eyes still gravitated toward one corner of the floor, where the smallest man in the room stood face to face with the loudest. Dave Bautista loomed like a mountain, his shadow stretching across the polished floor. His voice had already cut through the silence, his taunts designed to break pride, to humiliate. Yet Manny Pacquiao's calmness stood taller than any muscle, heavier than any insult. He slipped one glove on, then the other, adjusted the straps, pulled at the Velcro with a sharp rip that echoed louder than Dave's booming laugh. Every move was deliberate, almost ritualistic, as though he were preparing not for a fight but for something greater, something internal. The crowd shifted, whispering in confusion. "Why isn't he saying anything?" one man asked. "He should. Fight back?" a woman muttered, frowning. Another voice replied, "No, look at him. He's not angry. He's waiting." That word, waiting, spread quietly, like a spark through dry grass. Because in Manny's stillness, in his refusal to lash out, there was an unspoken strength. Dave's frustration grew. He stepped closer, his boots squeaking against the rubber mats. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" he sneered, pointing a finger directly into Manny's chest. "Or are you scared the truth is out? You don't belong here?" Manny simply looked down at the finger pressing against his shirt. His eyes lingered for a moment, calm and unreadable. Then he gently brushed the hand aside, not forcefully, not angrily, just firmly enough to let Bautista know. "This line you will not cross." The gym reacted with a collective gasp. Not because it was violent, it wasn't, but because it was power without noise. Dave's jaw tightened. His grin flickered into something else. Annoyance. Nearby, a janitor pushing a mop bucket paused, watching the scene unfold. Manny turned his head just slightly and nodded to the man, the same gentle smile still on his face. That simple act of respect, acknowledging someone most people ignored, did more damage to Dave's arrogance than any insult could have, because respect, shown in the face of disrespect, has its own weight. The silence dragged on, uncomfortable for everyone except Manny himself. He sat down on a nearby bench, calmly lacing his shoes tighter, his hands steady. His posture was relaxed but upright, not slouched, not defeated. He looked like a man in meditation, while Bautista looked like a storm struggling to be heard. "Theo," more Dave shouted, the smaller his words seemed. "This is a champion?" He laughed bitterly. "He can't even defend himself with words. Look at him, tiny, quiet, weak." But the crowd wasn't laughing anymore. The tone had shifted. A few shook their heads, whispering among themselves. "He doesn't look weak to me," someone said softly. "No," another agreed. "He looks unshakable." The phone cameras zoomed in. Every social media streamer knew silence this heavy meant something was coming. They didn't know what, but they could feel it. Dave, sensing he was losing the audience, grew louder. He flexed, punched his fist into his palm, tried to command attention. "You all see it, don't you?" he barked. "He's nothing here, just another immigrant taking space he doesn't deserve." The words cut deep, but Manny did not bite. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes lowered for a moment as though in prayer. Then he straightened, his gaze rising slowly to meet Dave's. And in that gaze was no fire, no rage, only a calm so profound it unsettled even the boldest. His eyes seemed to say, "I do not need to prove myself to you. The truth will reveal itself." Dave stepped back instinctively, though he tried to mask it with a scoff. The whispers grew again, only this time they weren't questioning Manny's silence. They were questioning Dave's noise. "Why does he keep pushing?" one voice asked. "Because silence makes bullies nervous," another answered, and it was true. For the first time since the confrontation began, Dave looked uneasy. His jabs, his taunts, his roars, none of them landed. They bounced off the wall of Manny's composure like fists against stone. Every second Manny remained calm, Dave's power weakened. The crowd began to sense it. The cameras kept rolling. What had started as mockery was turning into a lesson. Not through fists, not through fury, but through patience. Manny finally stood again, adjusting his gloves one last time. He didn't speak. He didn't gesture. He simply walked toward the heavy bag at the edge of the gym. With every step, the silence deepened, pulling the entire room into his rhythm. The bag swung slightly as he rested his glove against it, testing its weight. The entire gym held its breath. Still, not a word escaped his lips. And yet, in that silence, he had already spoken louder than Dave could ever shout. Because sometimes, strength isn't measured in volume. It's measured in restraint. The gym was learning that truth, slowly, painfully, and Dave Bautista, for all his size and swagger, was beginning to realize he was losing. Not the fight he wanted, but the respect of every single person watching. The heavy bag swung lightly under Manny's touch, the faint creak of its chains cutting through the gym's tense silence. Every eye still followed him, waiting for the explosion that never came. But instead of fire, Manny brought calm. And that calm had begun to unsettle not only Dave Bautista, but everyone watching. Among the crowd was a boy, no older than 12, clutching his father's hand near the cardio machines. His gym shorts hung loosely on him, his sneakers a little too big. He was Filipino American, his dark hair damp with sweat from earlier drills. He had been training quietly before the commotion started, but now his wide eyes were fixed on Manny. He tugged gently at his father's arm, whispering in a small, shaky voice, "Papa, that's Manny Pacquiao, isn't it? Lolo used to tell me stories about him." The father nodded, his lips pressed tightly together, uncomfortable at the scene unfolding. "Yes, hijo. That's the champion. The one who fought for our people." The boy's brow furrowed as he looked from Manny to Dave. But why are they laughing at him? Why did he tell him to go back? The father had no answer. His silence was heavier than the weight stacked on the racks. Manny, though he had not spoken to the crowd, noticed the boy. Their eyes met across the room for just a moment. Manny gave him a small smile, gentle, reassuring, the kind that said, "Do not be ashamed. Stand tall." It was only a second, but for the boy it meant the world. Dave, still circling like a predator searching for weakness, noticed the glance. He mistook it for hesitation. "What's this? Looking for sympathy?" He barked, his laughter filling the air again. "Even kids see you for what you are, small, weak, out of place." But what Dave didn't realize was that in mocking, he was teaching the wrong lesson to the youngest eyes in the room. The boy's face fell, confusion mixing with hurt. His father pulled him closer, whispering, "Don't listen, Hijo. This isn't who Manny is. Watch, you'll see." And indeed they would. Because just then, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. From the far corner, a janitor, an older man with a bent back and rough hands, paused his sweeping. His accent was thick, his English broken, but his words carried honesty. "You don't know respect," he muttered toward Dave, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "That man, he fights with his heart. He gives to people like us." Few heads turned. Some nodded quietly. Dave's face darkened. "Stay out of this," he snapped, glaring at the janitor. "This is between men." But Manny lifted a hand, palm open, signaling peace. His voice finally broke the silence. Soft, low, but steady. "Sir," he said to the janitor, "thank you." It wasn't loud. It wasn't grand. Yet it carried, across the gym, bouncing off the mirrors, threading its way into every heart. Because in that moment, Manny chose to acknowledge the invisible, the worker most would never notice. The boy tugged on his father's arm again, whispering louder, this time. "See? He's not weak, he's strong, without fighting." That single observation, innocent and unfiltered, spread to those around them. A woman by the treadmills repeated softly, "Strong without fighting." Others murmured in agreement, the Isaiah. Jim's energy shifted, phones still recorded, but the tone of the crowd was changing. Whispers turned from mockery to reflection. People who had laughed earlier now looked uneasy, glancing between Manny's calm and Dave's rage. Dave, however, was not done. His pride bristled at the loss of attention. He jabbed a finger toward the boy in the corner. "You, kid, watch, closely. This is what happens when you don't stand up for yourself. You'll never make it in this country if you're weak like him." Gasps shot through the crowd. The father pulled his son protectively behind him, glaring, but Manny stepped forward, his expression still calm. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. Instead, he addressed the boy directly, his voice warm, almost fatherly. "Don't believe that," Manny said gently. "Strength isn't how loud you shout or how big your muscles are. True strength is in how you carry yourself even when others insult you." The boy's eyes widened, his small chest lifting with new pride. The father blinked back emotion, nodding silently in gratitude. And with those words, the balance of the room shifted further. Manny wasn't just responding to Dave. He was speaking to everyone who had ever been mocked, belittled, or told they didn't belong. The janitor straightened slightly, pride flickering in his tired eyes. The boy stood taller beside his father. Even some of the athletes who had chuckled earlier now shifted uncomfortably, realizing the cruelty of their silence. Dave tried to laugh it off, flexing again, raising his voice. "Don't be fooled, words are cheap. He's trying to play saint. This is America. We earn respect with power, not pity." But the crowd wasn't convinced anymore. The more Dave shouted, the more hollow his words sounded. And the more Manny stayed calm, the stronger his presence grew. Because now Manny wasn't just standing for himself. He was standing for the janitor ignored in the corner, for the boy learning what dignity looked like, for every immigrant who had ever been told they didn't belong. And while Dave roared for dominance, Manny's silence, his smile, and his few measured words had already begun to teach a lesson the entire gym would never forget. The silence that followed Manny's calm words to the boy was heavy, like the air just before a storm breaks. For a long moment, nobody moved. Even the sound of dumbbells dropping seemed distant. Dave Bautista's smirk faltered as he realized the crowd was no longer laughing with him. They were listening to someone else. It started quietly. From the side of the gym, where a few older trainers stood with crossed arms, one of them finally spoke. His voice was gravelly, worn by years of coaching fighters. "That man you're mocking," he said firmly, eyes fixed on Dave, "isn't just a boxer. He's one of the greatest champions this sport has ever seen. And unlike most, he never forgot where he came from." The words cut through the gym like a blade. Some nodded, others looked around awkwardly, but the seed had been planted. Another voice joined in, a middle-aged woman in business attire still in her work heels who had stopped to watch the scene unfold. She adjusted her glasses, then pointed at Manny. "I once met him in Manila," she said. "It was after a charity event. He spent hours giving food to children who had nothing. No cameras, no headlines, just kindness." The murmurs grew. People who moments earlier had stayed silent were now recalling stories, moments, memories. A man with a faded boxing jacket stepped forward. He looked American-born, but his eyes carried respect. "I was in Vegas years ago when he fought to my La Jolla," he said proudly. "Everyone thought he'd lose. He shocked the world that night, and afterward, he thanked the crowd, thanked America, and said he was proud to represent the Philippines. Tell me, Bautista, what have you ever given back like that?" Gasps and murmurs rippled across the room. Dave's jaw clenched, his fist tightening at his side. He had built his life on being larger than life, but here, strangers were tearing down his arrogance with nothing more than the truth. From the back of the crowd, a younger trainer spoke up. His voice cracked with emotion. "I was homeless once. Didn't have a bed, didn't have food. Someone handed me a ticket to a Manny fight. I didn't know who he was at the time, but I watched him fight like his life depended on it. And when he won, he said in his interview, 'This victory is for those who have nothing, but still keep fighting.' That night gave me hope. I decided if he could rise, so could I." The gym fell into hushed awe. A few people wiped their eyes. Dave tried to laugh it off, his voice booming again. "Stories, old fights. None of that matters here. This is about now, in this gym, in this country. And here he's nothing." But before he could continue, another testimony shut him down. An elderly man, thin white hair combed neatly back, had been sitting on a bench watching quietly. He pushed himself up slowly, leaning on his cane. "Son," he said, looking directly at Dave, "I've fought in wars you can't imagine. I've seen courage, and I've seen arrogance. And I can tell you this, courage looks a lot like that man." He pointed at Manny. "Arrogance? That looks a lot like you." The crowd erupted, not in laughter, not in mockery, but in applause. It began softly, a few claps, then louder, until the sound of hands slapping together filled the gym. Dave's face reddened, his chest heaved. He glanced around desperately, trying to hold on to the crowd that was slipping from his grip. "You're all fools," he spat. "He's playing you. He's weak." But no one laughed anymore. Even some of the young athletes, who had chuckled earlier, now avoided his gaze, ashamed of their silence. A woman whispered to her friend, "I can't believe we actually laughed at Manny. Look at the way he's carrying himself. That's real strength." The janitor, still holding his mop, spoke again softly, almost to himself but loud enough for others to hear. "Respect is free, but pride? Pride can cost you everything." The boy near the treadmills whispered back to his father, "They see it now, Papa. They see who he really is." Manny hadn't spoken more than a handful of words, and yet his presence had changed the atmosphere entirely. He had said nothing in defense of himself. He hadn't shouted, hadn't threatened, hadn't boasted. The people around him did that, for him, not because he asked, but because his life had already written the testimony. It was no longer just Manny versus Dave. It was arrogance versus truth, noise versus respect, and slowly, visibly, Bautista was losing. The applause died down, leaving a silence even heavier than before. Manny stood quietly, his gloves resting against his sides, his eyes calm, and then, for the first time since the confrontation began, he took a small step forward. His lips parted, his voice low but steady, as though each word carried the weight of every testimony spoken. "Respect isn't given by size, or taken by shouting," he said softly. "It's earned by how you treat others." The gym froze. The storm was coming. The reveal was near, and everyone, every trainer, every athlete, every stranger holding up a phone, knew they were about to witness something unforgettable. The gym was no longer a place of weights and mirrors. It had become a stage. Every breath felt amplified, every heartbeat echoed in the silence that followed Manny Pacquiao's words. Dave Bautista, towering and trembling with frustration, clenched his fists. The veins in his arms bulged, as if they carried not blood, but rage. He could feel the crowd slipping from him, the power of attention he thrived on draining away, and all of it was because of a man half his size, standing calmly, without a single insult, without a single roar. "Enough," Dave shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. He slammed his palm against a weight rack, sending the plates rattling. "You all think he's some kind of saint? He's nothing. I said it before. He doesn't belong here." The words fell flat. No laughter followed, no smirks. The crowd stared at Dave, then back at Manny, waiting, not for Dave's anger, but for Manny's response. And finally, Manny stepped forward. His movements were unhurried, steady, each step measured. The floor mats squeaked faintly beneath his sneakers. The entire gym held its breath as he closed the gap between himself and Dave. The cameras zoomed in. The boy by the treadmills leaned forward, wide-eyed. Even the janitor gripped his mop tighter, as if bracing for what was about to come. Manny stopped only a few feet away from the giant of a man. His eyes rose slowly to meet Dave's. There was no hatred in them, only calm. His voice when he spoke was soft, but it cut deeper than any shout. "Do you know who I am?" The question landed like thunder. The crowd stiffened. A hush spread across the gym, so thick it felt like even the air refused to move. Dave blinked, momentarily stunned. For the first time, his confidence wavered. "You," Dave stammered, his voice faltering. "You're just a boxer past his prime." But the whispers that rolled through the crowd told a different story. "Pacquiao," one person murmured. "It is him. Manny Pacquiao, the people's champ." Recognition spread like wildfire. Phones lit up brighter, streams went live, names trended before anyone finished their sentences. America was watching, not through television, not through highlight reels, but live, raw, unfiltered. Dave's face paled. He had insulted not just a man, but a legend. Manny did not gloat. He did not raise his fists. He simply tilted his head slightly, his tone still patient. "You judged me by my clothes, by my silence, by where I was born. But respect has no nationality. Kindness has no borders, and strength." He placed a hand lightly on his chest. "Strength is not measured here," he said, gesturing to Dave's bulging arms. "But here." He tapped his heart. The words struck like lightning. Gasps echoed. The boy near the treadmills clapped his small hands instinctively. Others followed, hesitant at first, then louder until the gym filled with applause. Dave's mouth opened, then shut. His arrogance crumbled in the face of truth. But Manny wasn't finished. He turned to the crowd, his voice carrying now, strong and clear. "This young boy," he said, pointing gently toward the Filipino child, "will grow up in this country. He will hear words like the ones spoken today. Words meant to shame him, to make him feel small. But let me ask you, will you teach him that strength is in shouting, or will you teach him that strength is in respect?" The crowd fell into stunned silence again. Even the influencers, usually desperate for drama, lowered their phones slightly, caught in the weight of his words. Manny then faced Dave once more. His expression was calm, almost sympathetic. "You see me as small, but small men can cast long shadows when they stand for something greater than themselves. You wanted to embarrass me, but in doing so, you revealed more about yourself than about me." Dave's chest heaved. His fists unclenched slowly, his eyes darting to the floor, then back to the crowd. For the first time, he looked unsure. Not of Manny, but of himself. And then, without warning, Manny turned to the heavy bag. The gym followed him with their eyes. He raised his gloved fists, squared his stance, and unleashed a flurry of punches, fast, sharp, precise. The bag swung violently under the barrage, chains rattling, leather creaking. The sheer speed and power left jaws hanging. When he stopped, the bag was still swaying, the sound of the final strike still echoing. Manny looked back at Dave, his breathing calm, his posture steady. "That," he said softly, "is strength. But I don't use it to humiliate. I use it to uplift." The applause erupted again, this time thunderous, undeniable. People stood on benches, clapping, cheering. The boy's father wiped his eyes. The janitor bowed his head. The trainers exchanged knowing nods. Dave, once the loudest voice in the room, now stood silent, his arrogance stripped bare. His size meant nothing. His roar meant nothing. Against Manny's humility, he was the small one. Manny raised his voice, one last time, not in anger but in clarity. "Remember this, respect is the greatest victory, and without it, no man, no matter how strong, can ever truly win." The gym roared with applause, louder than any arena, louder than any fight. America wasn't just watching, it was learning. The applause rolled through the gym like a wave, crashing against every corner, every wall, every mirror. For a moment, the place that had been filled with mockery and arrogance now pulsed with respect. Phones stopped recording, not because people lost interest, but because they realized they were part of a moment too sacred to be reduced to content. Manny Pacquiao stood quietly, his gloves hanging at his sides, his eyes soft yet steady. He hadn't shouted, he hadn't insulted, and yet the room belonged to him. Not through fear, but through dignity. Dave Bautista, once towering with swagger, now stood awkwardly. His massive frame looked smaller somehow, weighed down by shame. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. His arrogance had been silenced, not by fists, but by truth. The boy near the treadmill squeezed his father's hand, his chest puffed with pride. "Papa," he whispered. "He showed them. He showed all of them." His father nodded, his throat tight. "Yes, he-ho, that's what real strength looks like." The janitor leaned on his mop, eyes glistening. For years he had been invisible in places like this, but today he had witnessed a man who saw him, not as background, but as human, and that recognition healed something deep inside him. Manny finally broke the silence, his voice calm, carrying across the gym. "This isn't about me," he said, glancing at the crowd, then back at Dave. "It's about how we treat people when we think no one is watching. Titles fade, muscles fade, but character stays." He walked slowly toward the boy and bent down, so their eyes met. "Never let anyone tell you where you don't belong," Manny said gently, "because dignity is not given by others, it's carried here." He tapped the boy's chest with his glove. The boy smiled through teary eyes, nodding firmly. In that moment, a seed had been planted, not of anger, but of resilience, the kind that would last a lifetime. Manny rose again, facing the entire room. "You all clapped for power tonight," he said softly. "But remember, real power is not in how hard you hit. It's in how gently you lift others." The words settled like stone in water, rippling through every listener. The trainers who had once watched silently now stood straighter, ashamed of their earlier hesitation. The businesswoman wiped her eyes. Even the influencers lowered their phones completely, realizing they had captured something far more meaningful than drama. They had captured a lesson. Dave finally found his voice, though it was no longer loud. I didn't know," he muttered, looking at the floor. "I didn't realize." Manny offered him no scorn, only a steady gaze. "That's the danger," he said quietly. "Judging before knowing." We all make mistakes. But the question is, will we learn from them? Dave swallowed hard, his bravado gone. He gave a small nod, unable to meet Manny's eyes. And just like that, the confrontation was over. Not with a fight, not with security, not with violence, but with humility and truth. Manny picked up his bag, slung it over his shoulder, and walked toward the exit. The crowd parted instinctively, giving him a path, their faces filled with admiration. Some clapped again, some bowed their heads. All of them carried something they hadn't come for, a lesson in respect. At the doorway, Manny paused. He turned slightly, his voice calm but carrying the weight of everything that had happened. The greatest victory, he said, is not in the ring or in fame. It's in how we treat those who seem smaller than us. Because one day it may be their kindness that saves us. With that, he stepped out into the evening air. The gym doors swung shut behind him, leaving the crowd in a silence more powerful than thunder. The boy still clutched his father's hand, his eyes shining with hope. The janitor returned to his mop, but with a lighter heart. And Dave Bautista? He remained frozen in thought, the lesson echoing louder than any cheer he had ever received. The gym, once filled with arrogance, had been transformed. Not by a fight, not by a show of fists, but by a man who proved that the quietest voice can sometimes roar the loudest. And as the video of that night spread across America, millions would remember it not as a moment of insult, but as a reminder that dignity, respect, and kindness will always outshine power, arrogance, and pride. Have you ever been judged unfairly because of where you come from? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story might just inspire you even more.